Before she could even introduce herself, he cut her off with a question that froze the room. Joe Rogan leaned forward into the mic, eyes narrowing, voice sharp and skeptical. "What makes you qualified to sit in that chair, to make decisions that affect millions of people?" The words landed like a gauntlet thrown in the middle of an arena. There was no warm up, no easing into the conversation, just a strike straight at the heart of her identity. Jasmine Crockett sat upright, her hands folded calmly on the table. 1,000 lights seemed to burn brighter on her face in that moment. For an instant, the atmosphere inside the studio felt like a cage fight more than a conversation. Rogan's listeners, millions of them, waited for her to flinch, to stumble, to prove his skepticism right. And that was the power of this moment. Rogan wasn't just asking about her RA. He was testing whether her story, her experience, her entire life's work was enough. He was voicing a doubt that countless people have whispered about leaders like her. Do you really belong here? Do you really deserve this stage? The air between them grew heavy. Silence expanded as if the walls themselves leaned in closer. Online, the clip would already be cutting through timelines, replays looping, captions screaming in bold text. Rogan puts Crockett on the spot. Viewers watching in real time held their breath, waiting for the answer. For Jasmine Crockett, it wasn't just about personal pride. It was about every immigrant child told their accent was too thick. Every black woman told her voice was too loud. Every working class leader told their background wasn't polished enough for the halls of power. She could feel that weight pressing against her shoulders, daring her to falter. But she didn't blink. Her silence wasn't hesitation, it was composure. She knew something Rogan didn't, and as she leaned slightly forward, a quiet fire flickering in her eyes, it was clear this confrontation wouldn't go the way he expected. The room held its breath. The audience leaned closer. Social media's fingers hovered over keyboards, but no one expected what she would say next. The moment carried more weight than anyone watching realized. To the casual listener, it was just another Joe Rogan question. Direct, blunt, the kind that made him famous. But to those who understood the scale of his influence, it was clear this was no ordinary exchange. Rogan's studio wasn't just a podcast table. It was a stage where reputations were tested, where credibility could be built in an instant or torn down in front of millions. For years, Joe Rogan had carved out a reputation as the man unafraid to ask what others tiptoed around. His voice carried the swagger of someone who believed truth was always on the other end of a hard question. Fans adored him for his candor. Critics accused him of arrogance and bias, but one fact remained unshakable: a seat across from Joe Rogan was not a casual interview. It was a trial by fire. And in this trial, Rogan's role was clear. He wasn't curious in that moment. He was dismissive, his tone heavy with the suggestion that Jasmine Crockett didn't belong in the conversation. His body language said it all, leaning back, eyebrows raised, lips tight in a half smirk. To him, this wasn't just about her record. It was about whether she could withstand the heat of his doubt, whether she could endure his arena. For Crockett, the stakes stretched far beyond her personal reputation. She wasn't merely a politician defending her race. She was standing as a proxy for every woman who had been interrupted before finishing a sentence. Every black leader who had been told they were unqualified. Every servant of the public who had been questioned not for their failures, but for daring to show up. Rogan's question tapped into centuries of skepticism, that old narrative designed to shrink voices like hers before they even spoke. The weight of that history pressed into the silence between them. Viewers felt it, even if they couldn't articulate it. Her answer, whatever it would be, wasn't just about one exchange. It was about how millions would perceive her strength, her legitimacy, her worthiness to occupy spaces traditionally reserved for men who looked nothing like her. And Rogan knew the power he wielded. His audience was vast, stretching from young men seeking direction to cultural commentators waiting for clips to dissect. If Crockett faltered, that stumble would echo far beyond this episode. Her hesitation would become a headline, her uncertainty weaponized in tweets and sound bites. That was the trap laid out before her, a snare built not of malice but of doubt sharpened into spectacle. The atmosphere in the studio pulsed with that tension. This wasn't simply a guest appearance, it was a crucible. Rogan's voice, dismissive yet casual, carried the implicit message: prove yourself. Defend your existence. Convince me, convince them, that you belong. And as the seconds ticked by, the audience leaned further into their screens, knowing something big was about to unfold. Because this wasn't just a question. It was a challenge that represented the invisible battles fought every day by those who dared to enter arenas never built for them. And in the next breath, Jasmine Crockett would decide whether to let that doubt define her, or to turn it into the spark that could silence it forever. The table was set. The trap was clear. And yet, what came next would unravel every expectation. To understand the weight of that question, you have to understand the man who asked it. Joe Rogan is no ordinary interviewer. He isn't the polite Sunday morning host tossing softball questions, nor the buttoned-up anchor with a tidy script. Rogan thrives in chaos. His podcast is a battleground disguised as a conversation, and his millions of listeners expect him to be the one holding the torch, shining it mercilessly into the faces of his guests. Rogan built his empire on unpredictability. One moment he's cracking a joke that disarms, the next he's launching into a line of questioning that feels less like dialogue and more like interrogation. His background in stand-up comedy sharpened his wit. His years in martial arts etched in him the instincts of a fighter. And that is exactly how he approaches debate, like a match in which dominance must be asserted, blows landed, balance broken. Over the years, countless guests have walked into his studio confident, only to leave shaken. Politicians, scientists, activists, celebrities, few have been spared his relentless prodding. Some found themselves fumbling for words as Rogan leaned in, eyebrows raised, demanding clarity. Others grew defensive, his often skepticism pushing them into corners they never expected to defend. Clips of these moments often go viral, not because Rogan was cruel, but because he was unflinching. To his fans, that was authenticity. To his critics, it was arrogance. Take the times he grilled doctors and researchers during the pandemic, pushing, interrupting, refusing to let credentials shield anyone from his scrutiny. Or when celebrities came on expecting an easy chat, only to be hit with questions that revealed contradictions in their own beliefs. Rogan relished those moments, not out of malice, but out of an instinct to question everything. His audience ate it up. They expected him to be brash, to push boundaries, to say what others wouldn't dare. It was his brand. It was his power. And that power was immense. Millions tuned in, day after day, not just to hear his guests but to watch him dominate them. His platform wasn't neutral ground, it was his arena, his rules. A guest sitting across from him was already at a disadvantage. The sheer size of his audience meant the stakes were never equal. Rogan was the gatekeeper, the judge, and often, the executioner of reputations. For someone like Jasmine Crockett, this imbalance was especially stark. She wasn't walking into the studio as a comedian looking for laughs or a celebrity promoting a movie. She was walking in with the weight of public service, the burden of representation, and the knowledge that one wrong step could feed a machine eager to question her worth. Rogan's reputation preceded him, and his fans were already expecting the clash. They were ready to watch him dismantle, ready for the soundbite of him leaving yet another guest tongue-tied. That's what made his cockiness so effective. He didn't need to raise his voice. His casual demeanor, the smirk, the shrug, the tone of a man who'd asked 1,000 impossible questions, was intimidating enough. To many, he was a cultural juggernaut, a man whose opinions could shift conversations across the nation. To others, he was the embodiment of unchecked bravado, a gatekeeper who too often reinforced the very barriers he claimed to question. And yet, it was precisely this reputation that made his question to Crockett so piercing. When Rogan challenged someone, the default assumption was that he would win. His unpredictability, his knack for pressing until cracks appeared, made him a figure few dared to underestimate. His audience, loyal and vast, tuned in not just to hear but to judge. They were conditioned to expect him to walk away with the upper hand. That imbalance defined the moment. Rogan's question wasn't asked in a vacuum. It was delivered from a platform that had crushed many before. It carried with it the weight of his history, his bravado, his reputation as the man who could shake anyone's foundation. For Crockett, that meant the pressure wasn't just to answer, but to survive, to hold steady in a storm designed to unnerve. And yet, history has a way of surprising those who think the script is already written. Rogan, brash and unfiltered, may have believed he was setting the terms of this duel. His audience, confident in his dominance, may have expected another rout. But what no one anticipated was that the very qualities that gave him power, his cockiness, his skepticism, his stage, would become the tools of his undoing. Because this time, the tables were about to turn. Long before Jasmine Crockett found herself across the table from Joe Rogan, she had been tested in ways that left her immune to casual dismissal. Her story did not begin with applause or prestige. It began in the quiet grind of classrooms where she was often the only black woman in the room. Her hand raised not just to answer questions, but to challenge assumptions that others let slide. She grew up with the same barriers that keep so many from even dreaming of public life. Student debt looming like a mountain, expectations lowered by people who saw only her race or her gender, not her potential. Yet every obstacle became another notch in her armor. While others were handed doors already open, she pushed through walls, refusing to accept that the places of power were not meant for her. Law school was a crucible. Long nights buried in case law, endless exams, the weight of knowing that every misstep would be seen not as her failure alone, but as proof of what people like her supposedly couldn't do. She carried that burden into the courtroom, where she learned the sharp edge of cross-examination, where she saw how bias and stereotype seeped into the smallest gestures of judges and juries. When she defended clients who had no one else, she didn't just argue the law. She argued against a system tilted from the start. Those early years hardened her resolve. Crockett didn't have the luxury of easing into her profession. She faced condescension head-on. Older lawyers interrupting her, opponents laughing off her presence, reporters misidentifying her role as if she were an assistant rather than the lead attorney. But each slight only sharpened her determination. She won cases not because they were easy, but because she refused to let doubt win. Her reputation grew, not as someone with privilege behind her, but as someone who had fought for every inch of credibility she owned. When she stepped into Texas politics, the battlefield only expanded. Texas was not designed to be gentle to voices like hers. The halls of its legislature echoed with traditions that had, for generations, kept women like her on the margins. Critics were quick to label her as loud, as emotional, as unqualified. Old stereotypes recycled with new vocabulary. Yet Crockett leaned into that resistance. Where others tried to diminish her, she raised her voice louder. Where opponents mocked her, she met them with facts and fire. It was never easy. Campaign trails meant long days shaking hands in communities that had been told their votes didn't matter. Fundraising meant battling donor skepticism, convincing even allies that she was worth the investment. And all the while, student loans still followed her, a reminder that she wasn't born into wealth or power. Her authenticity was her strength. She had lived the struggles her constituents faced. She knew the sacrifice of balancing bills with service. That reality grounded her in ways that no attack could shake. And with each election, each legislative battle, each national appearance, Jasmine Crockett proved again and again that she wasn't there to be tolerated. She was there to lead. Her critics underestimated her resilience, mistaking composure for weakness. They didn't see the years of practice, the courtroom scars, the late-night study sessions, the weight of history pressing down and the refusal to let it break her. This was why, sitting across from Rogan, she didn't flinch. His dismissive question was nothing new. She had heard versions of it her entire life. Are you really qualified? Do you really belong here? The words might change, the tone might shift, but the message was always the same. And every single time, she had answered not just with words, but with action. Passing laws, winning cases, building coalitions, refusing to shrink in the face of skepticism. For Crockett, this was more than an interview. It was the next chapter in a lifelong pattern of proving wrong those who assumed she would falter. Her law background gave her the evidence. Her courtroom battles gave her the composure. Her political fights gave her the platform. She had weathered storms fiercer than one man with a microphone, and she had learned that calm, steady confidence could be more devastating than any shouted retort. As Rogan leaned in, expecting a stumble, expecting hesitation, he was confronting someone who had trained her entire life for moments exactly like this. Every late night, every insult, every uphill climb had carved her into a fighter who could not be rattled by arrogance. She had nothing left to prove to herself, but she was more than ready to prove it to him. Every battle had prepared her for this exact moment. The first question had barely settled when Rogan pressed again, sharper this time, unwilling to give Crockett the space to ease into her rhythm. "Okay," he said, leaning forward, voice tightening with impatience. "But credentials aren't just about having a degree. Lots of people have degrees. What makes you different? Why should anyone trust that you're the one with answers?" The cadence of his words carried that familiar edge. Less curiosity, more challenge. His listeners had heard it before, the probing tone designed to push a guest off balance. And in that moment, the entire room seemed to hold its breath, waiting for Crockett to stumble. But she didn't. Her posture never wavered. She clasped her hands together and answered evenly, as though the heat of his skepticism couldn't penetrate her calm. "Trust," she began, "isn't built on degrees hanging on a wall. It's built on work, on showing up, again and again, for people who don't have a voice in rooms like this." Rogan tilted his head, unconvinced. His expression hardened, his tone edging toward dismissive. "That sounds good." He cut in, "But people hear that from politicians all the time. Talk is cheap. Everyone says they show up. Where's the proof that you've done more than just talk?" The jab was obvious. He wasn't just asking for evidence. He was framing her as just another voice in a crowd of politicians, indistinguishable, forgettable. It was the kind of interruption that rattled weaker guests, but Crockett's composure didn't falter. Still, the tension thickened. Viewers watching from screens across the world could feel it. This was the escalation, the point where a back and forth could easily collapse into a verbal ambush. Rogan's tone was harder now, each question layered with an insinuation that she wasn't different, that she wasn't credible, that she didn't deserve the platform. Crockett didn't rush to fill the silence. She let the pause hang, her steady gaze unsettling in its own right. When she finally spoke, her voice carried the weight of lived experience rather than rehearsed lines. "I've been in courtrooms where no one expected me to win," she said slowly. "I've fought against opponents with more money, more power, more connections. And I've walked out of those rooms with verdicts that changed lives. That's proof, not slogans, results." For the first time, Rogan shifted in his seat. The studio's atmosphere thickened further. He tried again, his tone sharper, as though determined to cut through her composure. "Sure, but law isn't politics. Courtrooms aren't Congress. Isn't it a leap to say you're ready to handle the complexity of national issues when your experience is just local battles?" It was a classic Rogan tactic: minimize, reduce, frame her accomplishments as narrow. His words hung in the air like a challenge thrown across a ring. The trap was clear: defend herself too fiercely, and she risked sounding defensive; shrug it off, and she risked seeming weak. But Crockett didn't choose either path. She leaned forward slightly, eyes locked, and delivered her words with precision. "If you can fight for justice in a room stacked against you, if you can argue for the powerless when everyone assumes you'll lose, then you're already prepared for politics, because politics is nothing but that same fight, just with more cameras watching." The crowd, the unseen millions, could feel the stakes mounting. Rogan had built his brand on leaving guests cornered, scrambling for footing. But here, his jabs were meeting something sturdier, something that didn't crack under pressure, and that resilience only heightened the suspense. How long could she hold out? Would he finally land the blow that knocked her off balance? The questions piled up in viewers' minds, tension coiling tighter with each exchange. Rogan's voice sharpened again, the challenger refusing to relent. His next words, however, carried more weight, more bite, than anything he had said so far. And then, with the room hanging on his words, Rogan fired the question that no one thought she could answer. The question landed like a hammer. Rogan leaned back, arms crossed, his voice dripping with challenge. "So tell me, what exactly have you done that proves you deserve the kind of influence you're chasing? Beyond talking points, beyond speeches, what's the hard evidence?" The silence that followed was deliberate. Crockett didn't rush. She inhaled, exhaled, and let the pause stretch long enough for the tension to thicken. Every eye in the studio was fixed on her. Every ear listening online leaned in closer. Even Rogan, confident smirk curling at the edges of his mouth, seemed to anticipate an answer he believed would fall short. But when Crockett finally spoke, her voice carried the calm rhythm of someone who had been preparing for this moment her entire life. "You want evidence," she began. Her tone was steady, her eyes unwavering. "Let's talk about evidence." Another pause. The room quieted. The smirk on Rogan's face flickered ever so slightly. "I was the first in my family to graduate law school," she continued. "Not because doors were open for me, but because I worked 2 jobs while studying full-time. Because I carried student loans that still shadow me today. That's not a talking point. That's sacrifice." She let those words linger, not as a plea, but as a declaration. Rogan shifted slightly in his chair, as though adjusting to an unexpected weight in her response. "I became a public defender when I could have chased higher salaries in corporate law. I chose the harder path. I represented people who couldn't afford justice, who were written off before they even stepped into court. And when I won, when juries looked at me, doubted me, dismissed me, and I still won, that wasn't luck. That was preparation. That was work." The air tightened. Listeners at home could almost hear the beat of her words, each one cutting sharper than the last. Rogan opened his mouth to interject, but Crockett pressed on, her cadence rising, her confidence unshaken. "And when I ran for office in Texas, one of the hardest battlegrounds for someone like me, I didn't have billionaire donors. I didn't have networks lining up behind me. What I had was a community that believed in my fight. I walked into neighborhoods that had been ignored for decades, knocked on doors until my knuckles bled, and told people their voices mattered. That's not rhetoric, that's real." She paused again, her eyes locking on Rogan. The silence stretched, thick with suspense. In that pause, The audience could almost see the weight of her story pressing against the skeptical posture of her host. "And let me remind you," she said, her voice softening but carrying sharper steel, "when lawmakers in my state tried to silence voters, when they passed bills designed to make it harder for people of color to cast a ballot, I didn't just complain. I walked out. I left the chamber. I risked arrest, because the stakes were higher than my own career. I stood with colleagues, and we fought to protect democracy itself. That's what I've done." The words hung in the air like a verdict. Rogan's smirk was gone now. His brow furrowed, his hands shifting nervously on the table. But Crockett wasn't finished. "You ask what makes me different. What gives me the right to sit here, to speak, to lead? I'll tell you. Because I have lived the struggle of the people I represent. I know what it means to choose between paying a bill and chasing a dream. I know what it means to walk into rooms where no one expects you to win, and then to win anyway. That's my evidence." A hush fell over the room. Even Rogan's producers, usually invisible, sat frozen behind their equipment. The imagined audience, millions strong, leaned forward as if the story were unfolding in their own living rooms. Social media timelines lit up in real time. "She's owning this." He looked shook. Rogan shifted again, searching for a foothold, but he began, his tone suddenly softer, the edge dulled. Crockett cut him off, not with volume, but with precision. "You ask for proof. I gave you proof. You asked for receipts. I handed you receipts. And I did it without raising my voice, without smearing anyone else, because dignity doesn't need to shout, it only needs to stand." Gasps echoed through the silence. The power dynamic had shifted. Rogan, the man who so often disarmed and dismantled his guests, sat momentarily speechless. His audience, conditioned to see him dominate, now watched him falter. Crockett leaned back, her composure intact, her presence commanding. And then, with quiet finality, she delivered the line that would echo long after the mics were turned off. "My qualifications aren't just on paper. They're in the lives I've changed, the battles I've fought, and the barriers I've broken. That's evidence you can't dismiss." The silence that followed was deafening. No laughter, no quips, no easy pivot. Just a stunned pause that seemed to stretch forever. Rogan looked down, then back up, his lips parted as though searching for words that refused to come. For once, the man who always had a comeback had none. Her final words didn't just silence him. They shook the entire room. And that's when the shockwaves began to spread. The silence in Rogan's studio lasted only seconds, but its echo reverberated far beyond those walls. By the time the episode went live, the internet had already begun to fracture under the weight of what viewers had just witnessed. Within minutes, hashtags sprouted across Twitter like wildfire. Crockett crushes, face speechless Joe for mic drop moment. Clips of Rogan's stunned expression, the furrowed brow, the slight parting of his lips, the awkward silence, circulated at lightning speed. TikTok edits layered Crockett's final words over slow, motion zooms of Rogan's face, dramatic music swelling as captions shouted, "This is what truth looks like." Memes bloomed across Instagram, pairing his silence with lines like, "When you thought it was checkmate, but she brought a whole new board." It wasn't just humor. It was validation, a collective exhale from people who had spent years watching women like Crockett ask to prove themselves again and again. Now they had a clip, a moment in time, that turned the script upside down. Commentators pounced. Progressive voices on YouTube and Twitch ran reaction streams replaying the exchange frame by frame, analyzing every glance, every pause. Influencers declared it the political moment of the month, dubbing Crockett the people's champion for her composure and clarity. Even late-night hosts wove it into their monologues, joking about Rogan finally running out of words. But the reaction wasn't one-sided. Rogan's loyal fan base split down the middle. Some applauded him for giving Crockett the platform in the first place, claiming the silence showed respect. Others, however, admitted what they rarely conceded, that their host had been outmatched. Comment threads filled with reluctant acknowledgments. "Gotta hand it to her. She came prepared." And, "This was the first time I've seen Joe actually speechless." The ripple spread further still. Conservative pundits scrambled to spin the moment, dismissing Crockett's speech as scripted or grandstanding. Yet their very urgency betrayed the impact. They knew the clip was out there, shaping narratives faster than they could counter them. Meanwhile, Crockett's own supporters erupted with pride. Community leaders shared the video at rallies, parents showed it to their children, and activists called it a blueprint for grace under fire. For every young woman told she wasn't enough, for every aspiring leader doubted before they spoke, Crockett's calm dismantling of Rogan's challenge became a rallying cry. News outlets picked it up, framing it as a cultural moment, not just a podcast exchange. Headlines read, Crockett leaves Rogan speechless, the viral takedown everyone's talking about. And, from courtroom to podcast arena, Jasmine Crockett stuns millions. And yet, the most remarkable part of the aftermath wasn't just the virality. It was the way Crockett's words traveled beyond screens into everyday conversations. In cafes and classrooms, in offices and on buses, people repeated her lines, quoted her phrases, and used her composure as a benchmark. For one rare moment in politics, dignity had gone viral. Rogan, for his part, tried to move on in subsequent episodes. He cracked jokes, he returned to his usual rhythm, but viewers noticed a shift. The man who prided himself on always steering the conversation had, for once, been steered. And that image, Joe Rogan, the untouchable interrogator, left in stunned silence, wasn't going away anytime soon. The shockwaves rolled outward, unstoppable. They shook digital platforms, spilled into television, and embedded themselves in popular culture. Crockett had walked into a room many thought she couldn't survive, and walked out not just unscathed, but elevated. But the biggest ripple wasn't online. It was in the halls of power. Didn't gloat, she didn't spike the ball, she didn't bask in the glow of having left one of the most powerful podcasters in the world speechless. Instead, she reframed the moment, reminding everyone why it mattered in the first place. Look, she said in a follow-up interview, her tone as steady as it had been across the table from Rogan. This was never about me versus him. It was about showing what dignity looks like when it meets arrogance. It was about proving that preparation will always outlast ego. Her words cut deeper than any viral clip could. She wasn't interested in scoring points. She was interested in setting an example. Crockett knew that millions had watched her not just as a politician, but as a symbol. They saw a black woman, the daughter of struggle and sacrifice, holding her ground against a cultural titan who was used to rattling his opponents. And she wanted those viewers to carry away more than a laugh at Rogan's silence. She wanted them to see themselves in her composure, her resilience, her refusal to shrink, because the truth was bigger than a podcast showdown. It was about the long history of people being told they weren't qualified, weren't ready, weren't enough. It was about the way arrogance often tries to drown out quiet confidence, the way ego tries to disguise itself as authority. Crockett's performance had been more than a rebuttal. It had been a lesson in what it means to endure with grace. She pointed back to her career, to the courtroom nights and the legislative fights, to the student loans and the long hours. None of that was glamorous, she explained. None of it went viral, but all of it prepared me for moments like this. That's the point. The work you do in silence, the sacrifices no one applauds. Those are what arm you when the spotlight finally swings your way. It was a reminder that resilience isn't born in the big moments. It's forged in the small, thankless ones. Her story resonated because it wasn't extraordinary in its struggle. It was ordinary. She had faced what so many faced: doubt, dismissal, uphill battles stacked by design. The difference was that she refused to let those battles write her ending. And now, millions saw the payoff of that persistence. Crockett's reflection turned the viral clip into a mirror. Viewers began to ask themselves, what battles am I fighting quietly, day after day? What dismissals have I endured without recognition? If she could carry that weight into the lion's den and walk out standing tall, what does that say about my own strength? That was the brilliance of her message. She didn't center herself as a lone hero, she placed herself in the continuum of struggle that so many share. She gave her audience not just validation, but a call to see dignity as their own weapon. Preparation, perseverance, resilience. These were not her unique possessions. They were universal tools, waiting in the hands of anyone willing to use them. The viral moment became something more than spectacle. It became proof. Proof that arrogance can be met with composure. Proof that truth, when spoken calmly and clearly, can silence even the loudest platforms. Proof that the fight for identity, dignity, and justice is never wasted effort, no matter how long it takes to be recognized. And as she closed her reflection, her words landed with the same gravity as they had in Rogan's studio. Because if she could hold her ground there, what could you achieve in your own fight? Joe Rogan questioned her credentials. Jasmine Crockett answered with unshakable calm, and in the end Rogan, the man who rarely runs out of words, was left speechless. It wasn't just an exchange on a podcast. It was a test of dignity versus doubt, of preparation versus showmanship, of truth against ego. And truth won. That's the heart of this story. Crockett didn't just defend herself, she defended the idea that lived experience, hard work, and perseverance are every bit as valid, if not more, than bluster and bravado. She reminded us that in an era obsessed with volume, it's composure that carries the greatest weight. And that's why her moment matters far beyond a single episode. It's a lesson we can carry into our own lives. When someone questions your worth, when someone tries to reduce your story to a soundbite, remember Crockett's poise. Remember that preparation outlasts arrogance, and that the truth has a way of silencing even the loudest critics. So here's my invitation to you: don't let this story stop here. Share it. Talk about it. Carry it into your own conversations. Let it be a spark for someone who doubts their place at the table, who wonders if they have the strength to keep going. Remind them they do, and if you believe moments like this matter, moments where dignity triumphs over doubt, then join us. Subscribe. Be part of a community that refuses to let arrogance write the story of our time. Because the mic may have dropped that night, but its echo is still ringing, and it's waiting for each of us to decide how loudly we'll let it carry.